Okay, welcome everyone. I'm excited to introduce our guest facilitator today. Amanda Bennett is an educator, consultant, and writer living in Durham, North Carolina. And currently she's also a doctoral candidate at Duke University. Her dissertation centers the work of Toni Morrison, Hortense Spillers, and Asada Shakur to develop a Black feminist pedagogy of vocabulary of feeling. As an educator and storyteller, she cultivates innovative ways of using language to guide people toward internal transformation, self-awareness, and social awareness. She also facilitates a poetry lab, a Black feminist reading group, and an emotional intelligence group for men. And she is the founder of Define and Empower, which is a lot and very impressive. And so we're so grateful that she's given us her time today, and we really appreciate that. So I'm going to turn it over to Amanda, and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, like a lot of the work that I've been doing with the different reading groups is an offshoot of what I've been doing in the classroom, of students really just wanting to dive into these feminist texts even more after leaving my class. So it's interesting to see the kind of community that can develop as a result of engaging in Black feminist pedagogies that prioritize vulnerability and community. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so I can walk us through the presentation. Let me see. Okay, so as the title says, it's going to be about Black feminist pedagogy and really about what Black feminist pedagogy means to me as an individual. And then I can trace kind of my origins as it relates to what folks I'm citing and thinking with. So as I mentioned on the flyer that was distributed, I want to focus on different components of Black feminist pedagogy, such as drawing on personal experiences to connect with students, designing syllabi that prioritize Black feminist thought and diversity, equity, and inclusion, helping students to become motivated by measures other than grades, designing creative writing prompts and assignments, and making principles of Black feminist thought relevant across disciplines, including STEM. And just for a bit of background, a lot of the pedagogical texts that I rely on are on this list. So Teaching Community by Bell Hooks, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Teaching to Transgress, Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Maree Brown, who's a fantastic young Black feminist. All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, and Some of Us Are Brave, by Akasha Gloria Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith, which is a really great text from the 80s that promotes the idea of a Black women's studies department. And based upon Black women's actual lived experiences. And then finally, the Combahee River Collective statement by the Combahee River Collective that was established in the 70s. And just thinking about how do we incorporate our political utopian visions into the way that we engage in the classroom? Because in my own pedagogical experience, I view the classroom as a kind of laboratory for what the future could be, and that really empowers students to be able to bring their full experience into the classroom and engage in the act of collectively creating something together with them. So just to walk through the different components that I mentioned earlier, I tend to draw on personal experiences when I'm in the classroom. So about me being, a woman, a Black woman from the South, different traumatic things that have happened in my life. And I think that it actually helps students to become more vulnerable in their own right when they see someone who is even just a few years older than them talking about, here are the ways that I have, really worked through these issues in practical ways through the texts that we're reading together. So, even the part about curating a syllabus that reflects lessons that I've learned over the last few years. So for example, I taught a class in the fall of 2020 called The Pieces of Toni Morrison, where I taught Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, her novel Sula, and her novel Beloved. And I use it as a way to talk about my own experiences navigating intergenerational trauma as a result of slavery and segregation, and even thinking about what it means to develop friendships and develop intimacy in the wake of discrimination. And I think that really helps students want to tie the books into their own actual lives in a way that was beyond just trying to advocate for grades or whatever. And then the final point about keeping abreast of drama and things on campus. So for example, at Duke, we had a student who put up like a toxicology report of George Floyd in one of the dormitories, basically implying that he like deserved to be murdered because he was intoxicated at the time. And we were able to have an honest conversation about that in our class. And Duke is a very elite university, so most of my students are typically not going to be Black. So we have to have honest conversations about what does it mean to be white or non-Black students in this environment, and how do we have compassion and want to engage with Black students who are being affected by these discriminatory events, and how do we use our classroom as an organizing space to push back against this ignorance. Basically getting them to use the skills that they learned in class to change the world around them. And we can begin that on the micro scale on campus, which is their most immediate surroundings. Then for syllabi, I like to build a lot of flexibility into my syllabus. I love being able to say, hey, this is like a skeleton of what we could do, but we'll be able to change things based upon how the class goes. So even in my Toni Morrison class, I had the novels that I knew I wanted to read with the class, but I was able to make room for different, online articles or other books, or even student presentations that they wanted to be able to contribute to the conversation. And then more specifically with that, I definitely allow my students to make their own additions to the syllabus of, hey, I saw this book, I saw this movie, I want to talk about it with the class, can we add it in? Of course. And that actually helps them be able to figure out their own connections to the text that we're reading, as opposed to me just imposing my singular interpretation onto them. And then even when I'm curating a syllabus, I typically only make syllabi with women, people of color. If there's a man on the syllabus, it's typically going to be queer. And I do that because I try to question myself and ask, who am I putting in a position of authority on a topic? And do I want that person to be a cishet white man or a Black feminist activist? And that helps us have conversations about how is power and authority constructed through things like race and gender and sexuality. And to even be able to juxtapose what my syllabus looks like versus, other syllabi that are mostly white men. And it's like, how does that change the way that we relate to each other in the classroom? How do people feel more empowered to speak and be themselves when they see people on a syllabus who look like them and share their experiences? Yes. And then I also try and find other motivations outside of grades. So honestly, in my classes, I typically will just give people A's. And I know that might be kind of controversial, but we end up having a discussion in class the day after I announce that about, why am I doing this? How have you all been socialized to be overly focused on doing what it takes to get an A as opposed to doing actual intellectual discovery? And in my experiences of doing this both times, multiple times, students have turned in much better and much more introspective and politically urgent work after I announced that they were all going to get A's rather than before, because before they were kind of appealing to me as an authority figure, which always carries a lot of artifice and performance. Whereas after that, it's like, that performance of authority is now gone, and now you can actually be yourself without fear of being reprimanded or, shut down. And even when they're writing, essays or projects about traumatic instances or their experiences as marginalized people, it would feel kind of punitive and absurd to just be grading them on a typical A through F ratio, as opposed to how can I give you feedback that helps you work through this problem in your life in order to empower other people. So to do that, I try and integrate actual life lessons into our learning objectives, like being a good friend. What are your core values? How do you be in community with other people? How do you navigate generational differences? How do you actually stand up for your beliefs once you know what your core values are? And I think that helps students realize, oh, I'm in college to learn how to be a, empowered functioning citizen and not just an automaton who kind of blindly follows whatever an authority figure says. Which then also gives them space to be able to push back against me, which is what I love of them saying, hey, Amanda, I don't quite agree with this, or I have a different perspective. Let's talk about it as a community. And even being able to model that and be like, hey, if you are vulnerable with an authority figure, you will not be shut down. You will not be harmed. It's actually safe for you to be yourself. And then the last part about this, I try to make students feel like they are collectively solving an urgent problem. So what are we going to do about being isolated in the pandemic? What are we going to do about racial injustice? What are we going to do about rape culture on campus? And the assignments I design are designed to have them engage in conversations with themselves, with each other in the classroom, and with their classmates across campus about these issues, which is a great motivator beyond just grades. And then, so other ways of creating motivation, I like to create a collective final assignment. So for the Toni Morrison class and the class I taught called Writing Hysteria, I had them do a collective final project in which they made a zine based upon creative projects that they did. So they were able to do videos, music, poetry, creative essays. Some did interviews, some did the queer spell books, for example, and they all had to compile them together based upon what was their interpretation of the class's main goals and themes. So then the responsibility is really on them to be like, hey, what did we learn this semester? How have I changed as a person? And how do I express that in a way that is both unique to me, but also understandable to a broader audience? And then, yeah, I actually do like gradually kind of ceding control to students as the semester goes on to really teach them, how do you make decisions in a way that are ethical, but also true to who you are? And also, how do you negotiate your desires that might be in conflict with students who are also in your classroom? So I like to kind of become a less and less prominent figure as the course goes on, as they begin to kind of take control of the journey that the course goes in. And so for the assignments that I do tend to create in the beginning, they're a bit heavier handed. I try and help them cultivate self-awareness. So, what perspectives have you had to draw on to create your self-image? I mean, has it been yourself? Has it been your family? Has it been society? Has it been patriarchy? And how does your image of yourself change as you look at these different perspectives that you're viewing yourself through? And then I also try and focus on emotional intelligence. So what do you mean by angry or happy or ashamed? So for example, for one assignment, I had them write what a word like happiness meant to them without actually using the word in the description to make them realize, oh, these are the experiences that I have tied to this word, and here's how I am able to process this emotion. And do I like processing it this way? If not, then I can find a new way of expressing this feeling. And I also, for this, wanted to show the zine that I made for the class. So let me see if I can like change the share. Okay, are y'all able to see that? I just changed the new zine page. Okay, awesome. So this zine, we called it Desideratum, the Pieces of Us for my Toni Morrison class. And my students, well, one of my students, Celine Way, designed the zine on a platform called Issue because we're still remote at the time because of COVID. So we were able to do a digital zine that we all put together collectively. So the table of contents shows what we did. I wrote an instructor's note that talks about my motivations. For context, I, at that time in fall 2020, had a dear friend who passed due to suicide. She was 25 years old. She had a lot of history of sexual violence, abuse, mental illness. And I really wove that into the actual core of the class to be able to use it as a way to talk about, hey, y'all are 20, 21 years old. How do we talk about things like mental illness and trauma so that you won't feel the need to isolate or self-harm anymore? Then I included the syllabus. And I can also send the link to y'all after the workshop is over, but I included, the assignments that I gave, the writings that I gave. The syllabus was entirely composed of women, mostly women of color, specifically Toni Morrison. Even in these early prompts, and I also taught my own writing in order to show people how to process events in their lives through creative writing like poetry and fiction. Let me see. And I also had longer written assignments as well. Let me go to it. Yeah, so for example, I had them write an essay in response to this essay called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe by Hortense Spillers. And that essay talks about the ways that Black women in America have been essentially erased or misnamed because of the legacies of slavery. And at the end of the essay, she talks about this figure of a monstrous woman who is able to name herself and end this cycle of erasure. And I had them write a 1 or 2 page narrative from the perspective of that monstrous woman and what would her world look like if she were able to name herself. And so here are the final projects that they made. And they could also collaborate if they wanted to. So these 2 students made a series of playlists based upon the 3 novels that we read. And they also in Photoshop made these like collages of different Black women to capture the emotional mood of the novels. And there are also QR codes on there that are able to be scanned so you can have access to the Spotify playlist directly. And then these two students collaborated to write a series of poems that are based on The Bluest Eye, but also upon To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and basically talking about how young men are hazed into toxic masculinity through things like violence during sports events or violence from their fathers, and basically exploring how men are forced into performing a kind of masculinity as a result of patriarchal violence. And this is another student. She was actually a pre-med student, but stepped into her artistic side in this class. And she went outside and painted her face in this really cool makeup look and wrote about her experiences of really putting herself out there and not caring what people think about her in order to inhabit this different artistic persona. She also made a song on the left and made this drawing of Pacola from The Bluest Eye mixed with the myth of Antigone. So this idea of a young woman who is forced into death because of her society's refusal to see her as she truly is. More kind of short fiction, some poetry by other students as well. They're based on Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, trying to capture the experience of escaping from slavery through literary work. Another pair of students did this awesome collaborative project in which they recorded their most vulnerable conversations on YouTube. And then they wrote a poem about it on the left side where they talked about what it meant for them to share themselves with each other. And one is Asian, one is white. And it's like, how do we talk about difference in a way that is not fetishizing that difference? Another student on the left, Celine, wrote these incredible short stanzas into poetry about not only Beloved, but also the experiences of Asian women, other women historically who have been made into ghosts or erased figures because of their refusal to conform. And then she also partnered up with her other friends in the class who were also her roommates who had to live in this frat house for a semester because of COVID. And they talked about making the space their own despite it being a space of oftentimes violence or other kinds of abuse. Yeah, they took pictures and edited the photos in that way. And even talking about how they lived collectively as a way to undo trauma they had experienced as children, and what it meant to feel safe living with people who understood you and saw you. And this final essay is by a student who was on the Duke soccer team and wrote about the relationship between psychological enslavement and also hazing and how it is a similar kind of process. Yeah, and I can get off of this page and go back to the presentation. Okay, and I actually wanted to do like a Jamboard thing where y'all had the opportunity to put any creative assignments that you've done in the past on the Jamboard, and then we can all talk about it. Let me get out of presentation mode and put the link in the chat. Okay, is everyone able to access that link? Just let me know.
Looks good.
Okay, let me pull it up on the screen. Yeah, so in there, feel free to just drop in creative assignments that you've done.
Amanda,
We'll just take like,
remind,
sorry, go ahead.
will you just remind folks who aren't maybe familiar with Jamboard, just how to drop in a note?
Absolutely. Yeah, you should be able to go to the left column here and click on sticky note and then just write whatever you want and then save it like that. And if folks aren't really into writing it on the Jamboard, you can just kind of say it here while we're waiting. Did anyone want to share any ideas while we're just waiting for the Jamboard to fill up? Yeah, I'm just like looking through these. These are so great. I love all of these. Wow, okay.
I don't understand.
What do you need help with, Debbie?
They're so small, I can't see them, and I don't know how to send a comment.
If
I can go ahead and make them.
Oh, so
If
you're commenting on this. I have questions about what I should do in some of my classes. I'll ask them later. But I still can't see these responses.
Okay, I'm gonna make them bigger. Does that help if I make them kind of bigger like
Thank you,
this?
Amanda. It does.
Of course. Let me see.
And where do I do this? You said something about click and paste, but
Yeah, if you go to the left side of your screen and you click on this little sticky note one and just click on that, and you
which
should
one
be
is
able
the
to.
sticky note one? This one?
The fourth one down from the top.
1, 2, 3, 4. This one?
Yes, and if you like this one right here where my clicker is.
And then I can put a comment in there if I want.
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
thank you.
And then click save.
Okay, thank you.
Make these bigger. Yeah, these are fantastic. Just trying to make everything bigger right quick.
Well, rather than writing this in, what you're motivating me to do, I will ask this, is I teach a course on the health system, and why not get up and say, I want all of you to feel comfortable when we talk about insurance and all these other things, different socioeconomic groups by race, by gender, by income, by race, by gender, by income, by socioeconomic status, and everything else. These issues all affect those groups differently. Shout out your feelings, shout out your experiences, and I should say something like that.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Okay,
and then be able to reflect on what it means to have different experiences.
Yeah, okay. I'll shut up.
No, that's perfect. I appreciate you saying that.
But healthcare it's different. These are all grad students. And I want to make everybody feel comfortable to say whatever they want to say. But then I had last year a white student who said things that offended everybody. And I have to learn how to, on the one hand, you want everybody to speak up, but on the other hand, how do you control that situation?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I, as a Black woman, will typically say if something has offended me as a teacher in class and just be like, hey, you're not really taking my experience into consideration, and just be able to talk about it with the class and see how they feel about it as well. Because it can be difficult for students of color to want to speak up during class about something that has been racist or offensive. So kind of making yourself as a teacher as the kind of first line of defense is really helpful.
Okay, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to shut up. Your presentation is more important.
No, it's good to ask these questions. Okay, I'm just like catching up on the different assignments that have been written in.
I actually think that that's a good question because that's the management of voice and but teaching the students how to use their voice in a way that is productive and constructive is really hard. So yeah, any insights, Amanda, that you have about it, I would love to hear.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I often try and have students go back in their own biographies, and especially for things like high school, and they'll realize, oh, a lot of things were happening that were actually quite discriminatory, and I was affected by them. Because as opposed to trying to get them to care about big issues from the top down, I try and get them to care about them from the individual up and make them almost begin to see through like a new pair of lenses how their world has been shaped by patriarchy, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. And once they begin to be comfortable talking about things that have happened to them, then they become more confident in their ability to speak about broader social issues. Yeah, and this is like also the problem of like white performative activism of have you done the internal work to build a life in which you are not having to compromise your beliefs in order to assimilate before trying to make statements about racial justice.
Well, if I'm a white person and I want to ask about somebody's healthcare experience, if they're Black, and if would it be helpful to say that my first experience is in life, I saw how unfair it was to certain people who happened to be Black and didn't have all these places to go for their healthcare that others did. And I also remember as a Jew growing up, how discriminatory I felt, how much discrimination I felt from anti-Semitism that didn't allow me to do the same things as other people. I want you to be sure to tell those stories so that we can work out how we go forward together or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I mean, and for students of color, at least in my experience, whiteness can appear like a monolith. So it's really helpful to be able to almost give the archaeological history of how whiteness gets constructed over time by talking about your individual stories of, oh, well, I'm a Jewish person, or I'm the child of immigrants, or I had to be assimilated gradually over time. I mean, that helps break down these larger than life ideas that can be so off-putting to students of color.
Can I say my parents were immigrants, and when my father became a doctor, I remember having a whole conversation at the dinner table when he said, I will not turn anybody away who cannot pay for me. I will not turn anybody away, period.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I got to shut up to give everybody else a chance and you a chance.
Of course. Yeah. Do anybody else have any questions? I do want to work through these different amazing assignments. Do anyone want to like comment on an assignment that they put up here just so we can discuss it?
Hi, Amanda. Thank you
Hey.
for gathering all this wisdom with us and sharing yours. I think that, so the couple of assignments I put up was the letter writing to your future self. I also have them write letters to somebody, a relative of theirs, around explaining issues of related to the class, but also just how it connects to their personal experience, which is something that I feel like you've highlighted, and I feel really close to that as a methodology. And then the accountability. So I'm merging my work as a restorative justice practitioner for 6 years into this, back into this academic role as a professor, and what I'm finding. And so in RJ work, the personal is like the center of wisdom and knowledge. And so I'm finding that a very powerful tool to come back to at all times, like bring in the personal and really think about how these issues reflect in our lives. I think that one of the limitations that I'm seeing in this work within the academic setting is the lack of them being able to be exposed to this kind of methodology outside of my class. And sort of and I think you spoke to this, so I'm very grateful about how the grades and this this institution that is so much about competition and individualism. So when you try to bring this kind of collective ancestral teachings into this space, it really is limited, right, by these constraints. And so I love these assignments, and I guess I really want to think about how to make this, these spaces a healing space for all of us. And so the issues around race and class and gender and sexuality that come up in my class, I think I feel like I have the skill to maneuver those conversations. I think I'm having a harder time translating them within the system of oppression, which is higher ed. And like, I know how to do that for like activist spaces. I know how to do that when we're talking about like dismantling other spaces that are oppressive, but within the academy, I feel pull around, like I still don't have a good footing in it. So just wanted to share that, and thank you for, just love to hear more from you about your journey and some of your ideas.
Of course, I appreciate you saying that, because I often feel the same way, because a lot of my, like white colleagues were saying that I'm completely crazy for making syllabi the way that I do, or making assignments the way that I do. But this is also, I feel like, where students have the opportunity to get a foothold in activist work of spreading the ideas from our classes to other classes that they're taking. So for example, my students are more vocal about saying, hey, could we do a creative project in other classes? And then having to educate professors in those classes about, hey, there are other ways to do this, and students are asking for it. So I have to step my game up and learn. And even having honest conversations with, white faculty, quite frankly, in my department about, hey, here's what I've been doing as a teacher. My students are really liking it. A lot of them are suffering because there's a pandemic or have family issues going on. How do we come together to nurture them and care for them? Because of course our job for them is to be teachers or whatever. But I mean, I view them as my kids in a way. And it's like, as a scholar of Black feminism, I'm just a steward who is responsible for, pushing forward and creating the next generation of young Black feminist activists. So we have to have some kind of care involved, like the culture of care involved in this pedagogical work. And if we're not investing in them on that level, then what kind of future could we possibly expect them to create if they don't see us modeling the care that we're giving to them? Did anybody else have any desire to comment on their prompts that they put here? They're all really good.
I'll say something about the CMC Book of Delights thing. I'm excited about this because that was our summer book for the first year incoming class. And a group of us are trying to kind of destabilize that tradition and take it out of the realm of like, great books, which is what it's been in recent years. And so this book of essays is, basically the conceit of the thing was Ross Gay wrote a delight every day for 1 year. And the Book of Delights is the result of that. And so they're personal essays, they're short, everybody can find a toehold. And we're gonna invite students to kind of take up that call, and they're each gonna produce one or more delights of their own. I mean, each class is kind of handling it differently, but then the idea is that we're gonna gather them together in a book at the end. And so this has just been a nice way to get all the first year students engaged as writers, and then get them reading each other's stuff, and centering the personal, and also centering writing about something that's not analytical necessarily, essays that kind of prompt them to stop and reflect on the world around them, which I think increasingly this very stressful semester is something they really need, and I'm hoping they're going to find value in.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, I personally think that personal writing is analytical because I mean, many of us know, academic
Totally.
practitioners who
Yeah.
claim to not be writing about themselves, but they're constantly writing about their childhood trauma, but won't acknowledge it. So they never get to actually figure out what happened to them. And they just
Yeah.
begin to inflict that violence onto other people. And it's like,
Yeah.
how do we teach people not to be afraid of their personal memories and their personal trauma so that they don't inflict it onto younger people?
Mhm. I guess I just meant like not, not analytical in the traditional sense of like, this is an official college essay. And so many first year students come into college thinking like they've failed already. You know what I mean? So we were just trying to make it something different.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's brilliant. And will they end up publishing these essays or like, yeah?
Yeah, the idea is, well, I don't know where we're going to, so far, we're going to be producing a book that they get to keep. And I don't know, if we'll find ways of posting it on the website or something like that. I think that would be really cool because I think it would be neat for incoming students to see. I should also say that it wasn't my idea. It's Megan Gallagher, who's also been a really wonderful and supportive CTL participant over the years. And she works in the Center for Writing and Public Discourse at CMC. So I'm just a happy participant, but I was not the creator.
Yeah, I mean, but you're the facilitator of it. I mean, and I love the fact that it probably will be published at some point, just so that students can feel even more invested in it of, I am a legitimate author, I can do this. I mean, it's kind of self-esteem boosting, which is frankly also for me, like the work of Black feminist pedagogy, like boosting their self-esteem. I see someone has their hand up.
Yeah, Barbara has her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
Hi, I love that idea of the book and the Book of Delights. It sounds wonderful. It sounds so, when students sometimes think about, I have to write something and other people are going to see it, it's going to be out there in the public domain. It can be very terrifying. So I love that it is like, this should be a delightful process, that you own this and your delight is your delight for you to share with the world. I think that's really beautiful. I don't know. I just felt like my heart got a little clenched. I had done something like, so in a class that I teach about college, I had the students, we read some different short stories about different folks' journeys to college, immigrant stories, stories of like white male privilege and going to college and not knowing what they're doing, all kinds of stories. And I asked my students to write their stories, and some of them wrote poems, some of them wrote something fictional, some wrote about all kinds of things. And then one of the students in the class said, it's a shame. And then we read each other's. We got into small groups and we read them and we shared them. And someone said, it's just a shame that it just sits here with us, and suggested that we make a book out of it. So I put it together as a PDF. And then also we didn't publish it. We sort of put together like a hard copy and gave it out. I gave everybody 2 copies. I could give it to somebody else. But I love the idea of publishing. It's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Yeah. And I love the idea of like a hardcover book as well. Yeah, that's fantastic. Does anybody else want to comment on theirs or any other thoughts about these different assignments?
Can I just say I'm really loving reading this collection of ideas, and it's making me think about how there are, it's not an all or nothing thing, and it's nice to think about how there are, small ways to incorporate it, small kind of like everyday ways even to incorporate it into your classroom. I really like that.
Absolutely. And I mean, so much of the work of Black feminist pedagogy for me has been freeing myself from these institutional trainings, because as I mentioned, I'm a PhD student at Duke University, and I have been trained in a very, Eurocentric way that privileges the ideas of, cishet white men who've been in power for centuries. And a lot of this ability to give my students freedom has been liberatory for me in the sense of, how will I know that I'm a good teacher if I don't have the typical things like grades or a final paper to judge myself on, but actually I see that I'm a good teacher through my students' well-being of, them pausing self-harming behaviors, or them beginning therapy, or them developing good friendships, or them becoming activists in their own right, or them publishing their own work creatively. Like it can't be quantified in the typical way that most university things can be, but they have a lot of value to me, quite frankly. And it helps me continue this work, gives me motivation to continue thinking in this way.
In relation to that, one of the things that had been hard, I'm the one who has this, I just wrote I remember this when I tell them to get into rabbit holes and to keep a track of the rabbit holes I suggest a TED Talk or something interesting, and that they can just, start getting into different things. And then I ask them to do reflections, and as I just reflect on what we talk about, and at least these are grad students, it's very hard for them to trust the process. It's very hard for them, like they're like, but what do you mean a reflection? But what do you mean? Like, I feel like sometimes I'm like, for God's sake, like this is we're just trying something new here. Can you trust the process? And they can't. They really want, and I think that you do a great job with this idea of giving them an A from the beginning. I have been talking to them like, I'm grading this course, don't worry too much about grades. Like if you do these reflections, you will get the points, don't worry, just do it. But still they have this mental blockage about it.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. And even the issue of trust of, people become very controlling or distrustful when they don't feel like it's safe to be themselves or safe to trust people. And it's like, how do we as a class collectively explore our own issues with trust as a result of trauma? And how do I as a teacher create an environment where I am, bearing my soul to you and making sure that you know that you will not be judged for experimenting with me? And it's like a thing of having to consistently prove myself over and over and over again, and not just relying on the authority of myself as the teacher. Like that no longer is actually useful at all. Which is like how they should be able to go through life and their relationships. Like people should be working to like earn your trust over and over again, not just taking advantage of you. And even helping them work through, what are your core values? Because as I showed in my presentation, some of mine that I wrote down were like trust, vulnerability, accountability, transparency, but for them, it could be different. So even having an exercise when you're like, what are your core values and why, could be helpful to help them feel more comfortable being free within themselves.
That's a good point.
I have a question. If I might ask, the concept of ungrading is really interesting to me. I have not had the courage to try it because I worry about accountability. I see some students putting in more effort than others. What has been your experience in terms of people prioritizing the work and doing a good job with it, even in an ungraded context?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the vast majority of my students actually began turning in better work once I began just giving them all A's, because they realized, oh, she actually means what she says when this is a space of vulnerability and artistic creativity. Like I had to extend that effort of trust by saying, hey, I'm not going to use grades as a punitive measure to make you behave. You have to regulate yourselves. I have had students who would begin to turn in like less work or were late, but when I talked to them, they were like, oh, I had an uncle who died, or, I'm sick, or I'm depressed right now. And just being able to have a conversation with them about, hey, what's going on? And can we work something out? Because a lot of the issue is them feeling uncomfortable telling the truth to teachers and worrying about being judged. Yeah. Wait, another hand up?
Oh, I just wanted to also speak to that. So I have had students who I thought didn't do as much work. And just like Amanda said, sometimes it's not that they didn't want to do it, but other things have happened. So when I do self-grading, or I just ask the students to write down for themselves on this document that we have, a shared document in class, like what would be a really wonderful experience for you this semester and what's your role in it? And then like, what are some milestones that you would like to achieve? And then we spend like every couple of weeks in class, I give them like 5 minutes to start writing, just to write like over the past 2 weeks, these are the ways that I stretched myself, or this is what I was trying to do. And I've had students say things like, I went to the climate strike, or I've been involved in my group. And so I haven't done the reading, but I've engaged in the conversations, or I've bookmarked this and I'm going to look back at it. And I think I try just to let go. Like if I say I'm not going to punish them, then I'm also going to trust them, right? I'm going to not be, I don't want to be the police. And so sometimes my mind goes there where I'm like, I don't know about that student. And then I just have to say, do a check-in, and it could just be an email. And then also just let them, that they're in charge of themselves. And that's what we want them to be by the end of the semester. So this is the best place for them to practice that, because it is low stakes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, the idea of them being in charge of themselves. Yeah. Were there any other folks who wanted to comment on prompts or had any other thoughts about this? I love the ways that folks are incorporating things like podcasts, other creative work, and even this idea of writing a musical autobiography. I think that's fantastic. Because I actually had a student last semester in my writing hysteria class who wrote a poem that he wrote in response to how a jazz song sounded, because he's like a classically trained jazz musician, and he ended up performing the poem over the jazz song. And it was beautiful to hear how his voice fit with like the sound of like the horns or different changes in the music over time. And even for my students who are neurodivergent, so autistic or ADHD or things like that, just being able to have assignments that fit with their expression of the world has been fantastic for them to be involved in class, because some folks literally cannot sit at a desk for 8 hours and write a paper. Like for students with severe ADHD, that's just not going to happen. But that doesn't mean that they're stupid. It just means that they need a different way to express what they're learning in class. Yeah, and even being attuned to, for example, my white students who have ADHD, they know how to get the accommodations, they know how to like ask for extra time, but my students who are people of color often either aren't diagnosed or don't know how to ask for the services or are afraid to because they won't be believed. So just being able to be flexible in that sense of, hey, I think that you have ADHD, or they come to you with it, and then just believing them and working with them on that basis, because that's also a scene of structural inequality too.
Yes, that's something that some students have shared with me, that some people know how to ask for things and they get things, and then other people just are too embarrassed to ask for anything. Even just like, tuition scholarships, things as important as that. Sometimes if you ask, you get them and they don't know how to, or they think that they can't.
Yeah, exactly. Which is also why my pedagogy tends to be so loose and allowing for them to have space to talk back, to practice. Hey, if you ask an authority figure for something, you actually could get it and you could get the support that you need. So how do we become a testing space for them to develop their voices in that way? Yeah, that's excellent. I'm just looking at the chat. Okay, any other comments on these assignments? Because we can also go to Q&A as well. So if there are no other comments, I can just, well, oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I really appreciate the comment that you just made about just trusting your students, because a lot of the time to get accessibility services, you need a doctor's note with an official diagnosis. And to get those, you have the assumption that they have access to the doctors, and normally that's like a specialist or something like that. And so if you don't have access to that doctor or anything like that, or to get that official diagnosis, even though you're having those issues and stuff like that, you're not able to get the help that you need. And so I think it is, I've worked with faculty that are like, no, I'm not going to, because I don't have the support of accessibility services. And so it's like, it puts up this wall of learning no matter what's happening. And so it just automatically shuts down all trust and all communication when that happens. And so I think that that's a big deal. And I think that it's something that definitely, as fellow learners, we need to accept for not just our students, but also for ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I'm 27, so I'm a millennial, but even in my generation, ADHD was not something that was really taken seriously because, for example, I actually do have ADHD, but I wasn't diagnosed until I was maybe 25 and like knee deep in a PhD program and wondering, am I actually stupid? But for Black women, for example, ADHD may show up differently than it would in like a young white man. So even being able to tap into my own experience and be like, hey, I recognize how systems can fail people and I'm going to believe you and let's figure out how to get you some help. So yeah, even like how we can be models of different experiences and how that can be so valuable for our students. And let me also just go back to the PowerPoint so I can just do like the last couple slides right quick. Okay. Yeah, and I just quickly wanted to talk about how do we translate Black feminist pedagogy into a STEM context. So whenever I have like STEM students in my classes, I notice that we often talk about, the colonial and anti-Black histories of, STEM fields generally. Even thinking of things like, what subjects would have been the objects of study for anthropology, for gynecology, and different kinds of medical experiments, and being able to think about that critically. And even how the assumption of objectivity in STEM can be a way to exclude the perspectives and experiences of people of color, women, queer folks, et cetera, who would have been otherwise erased by these objective practices. And I don't think that that actually reduces the effectiveness of STEM, but rather makes it a more welcoming place for people of color and women and queer folks who are actually involved in STEM. And I also had like a little reading list of possible STEM books that folks could teach in their classes to show the intersection of Black feminist pedagogy and STEM work. I really like The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. There's a great poetry collection called Anarcha Speaks, because Anarcha was an enslaved Black woman who was experimented upon by, I believe, Samuel Cartwright. And he did like hundreds of experiments upon her body without anesthesia. And that actually is what creates like the medical knowledge we have today around fistulas and other like vaginal and reproductive issues. But she wasn't credited and she didn't receive any kind of anesthesia or protection during those experiences. There's also Dark Matter by Simone Brown, which talks about the history of technological surveillance through a Black feminist lens and through the lens of slavery. There's Algorithms of Oppression and Body and Soul by Alondra Nelson. And the algorithms one talks about the racism of algorithms. So for example, why a Black person could like put their hand under an automatic soap dispenser and not be recognized by that. Body and Soul talks about the history of the Black Panthers medical program and how they were creating a really radical alternative to the racialized, gendered hierarchy within modern medicine. Then there's also Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, talking about the history of enslaved folks and lack of access to healthcare for Black folks in the 19th and 20th centuries. And then there's also Mama Might Be Better Off Dead by Laurie K. Abraham that talks about really the problems within systems like Medicare and Medicaid for Black folks in cities like Chicago, where Black folks will have chronic health issues like diabetes, cancer, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, but don't get the funding necessary from Medicaid to be able to pay for all of their disability accommodations. It's a great like anthropological study. So I'll also stop the share. Okay. Yeah. And now we can just chat and have Q&A, or if anybody had any other questions about the STEM text. I'm not in STEM, but I'm fascinated by this intersection. Oh, cool. Thanks for this suggestion about Ebony McGee's article. Yeah, did anybody have any other recommendations for possible STEM text use? And I guess also, is anybody here in, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, I'm doing some research on STEM and gender, but I find it, and this is the reason why I'm in this seminar, I find it hard. I could suggest a couple of texts, but it feels like they're too focused. Like when I think about gender and STEM, I always think that is too much of a white feminist perspective in a lot of things. And that's why I'm struggling. That's why I'm here. Like just really trying not to be a white feminist when I'm thinking of, but on the other hand, it is hard to treat everything at the same time. Like I talk to my students about the hierarchy, but is you know, you have to choose and pick. So yeah, I don't know. That was just my thought about that question right now about yeah, there's a lot of stuff on STEM, but it's very, very focused on gender. Same way that there's a lot of stuff in I'm organizational psychologist, there are a lot of stuff on gender and leadership. But again, it's very focused on this idea of gender as white women have, going up the ranks. And then it gives me an aftertaste of white feminism that I don't know how to deal with. So I'm here to learn ways that I can try to figure out how to deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally valid. And that's kind of why I focused on Anarcha Speaks in terms of how do we think about simultaneously someone who cannot consent because they're enslaved, but also can't consent because they're a woman. And how does her race during slavery put her in an even more precarious situation than a white woman at the time? Because she was literally given to this doctor by her owner because her fistula made her an unproductive worker on the plantation. And even being able to think about how those histories of oppression carry over into the present day of, what does representation of Black women look like in STEM, or how are Black women practitioners of STEM actually treated in the workplace? And how do these quote unquote objective lenses that we've used since slavery continue to the present day?
Mm-hmm.
And even, what voices do we take seriously as authorities in STEM conversations, and who are we citing in STEM conversations, and how is that also determined by this history of erasure, marginalization, and abuse? Oh yeah, Disordered Cosmos is great. I love Shonda Prescott Weinstein. And I think her mother is also a very prominent, radical Black feminist thinker too. So even using their story as a way of thinking about how Chandra is taking her mother's Black feminist teachings into a space of theoretical physics. And she's typically very outspoken as well on Twitter about the issues in STEM as a Black woman. Yeah. Did folks have any other questions about STEM or any other recommendations or ideas? Well, if not, did y'all have any Q&A that you wanted to do? Any lingering thoughts? I'm happy to chat.
Sorry, I'm busy kind of downloading all these things.
That's fine.
Hi, Amanda. I have a
Hey.
question. Thanks so much for sharing your work. I think in addition to working with students, I also find it really challenging working with faculty. And I think it's amazing to have assignments and innovative creative pieces for the students. But I don't find, there is resistance from the students, but I think there's a lot more resistance from the faculty. And I'm talking from the whole hierarchy, right? Not just from adjunct to assistant, associate, full tenure folks, even the people above the professors, the dean's chairs and provosts, what are your approaches? And I'm curious about how you approach epistemology, because even in the org sciences or positive psych, there's a lot of ways of thinking. And they're starting from that North Star. It's hard for me to, I'm not trying to give them crumbs about diversity. I'm not trying to tell them a little bit about Black feminists. I'm trying to talk to them about this is the center, and I want to orbit around that, versus your Western white ways of thinking, and let me be a little piece and tack onto that. So I know it's a big question, but that's what I'm thinking about and wondering about.
Yeah, I am currently struggling with the same thing. In my own way, I've kind of given up the desire to just be included. And instead of been focusing on making my own spaces through things like Define and Empower, or through the reading groups that I also talk about, because it was taking so much of my energy to, assimilate into these white spaces that were just so dead set on not appreciating my perspective, that I was like, why am I tearing myself apart trying to be what you want me to be, as opposed to focusing on my students who actually need me? And a lot of that is tied to psychology of people have the opportunity and power to maintain systems of control as a way to avoid being vulnerable. And that is how white supremacy often manifests, of people who are traumatized and have the ability to control situations and are dead set upon things being a certain way because they're anxious otherwise. Whereas people of color don't have the luxury to manifest our anxiety as authoritarian rule. So even being able to think about it from that perspective has been helpful to me to kind of delegitimize some of those claims to objectivity. I don't know if that helps in a structural sense. But I mean, even with my Define and Empower work, like my dream would be to be able to continue coming into these academic spaces and doing like lectures and workshops on Black feminist pedagogy, and teaching faculty and administrators, how do you think about these things from a perspective that is holistic and values our students and values who we are on our human journey.
So when you do these workshops, what is the demographics? Is very similar to what you're encountering today here?
The graphics, sorry.
The demographics, the diversity of the audience.
Yeah, I'd say that. Pretty much the same as this, yeah.
Okay.
My student ones can tend to be a bit more diverse, but yeah.
Yeah, because as you were talking about this, and Andrea, so nice to meet you. I just Googled you. So your comments have been so interesting. I feel like, like we're doing the work, but we're always the same people doing the work. And it's like, how do we, like, it feels like, of course, I'm learning so much from you today. And it is because also I'm ready to do the work and to learn from you. Mm-hmm. But I feel sometimes that we're preaching to the choir. So the people that want to learn more and more, we're learning more and more. But also I'm noticing something that is very interesting, is that because we learned so much, there's a point where we're like, oh my God, this is so simple and so easy to understand, that is so hard for me to understand how other people don't see this as clearly as I do. Mm-hmm. So it kind of creates this paradox where it's like, duh, of course it should be this way. And you see the higher ups in organizations, in institutional, in educational institutions going like, well, can you start? And you have to start from zero. And you're like, wow, like, I don't know, just thoughts on all these.
Yeah, I mean, I completely feel that. And I mean, this is also what the work of Define and Empower will do, but I hope of, recognizing that faculty are often at risk of being fired, for example, if there's people of color who speak out, whereas I could come in as an outside person and say, hey, based upon my expertise, here are my recommendations, and really forcing people to come up to speed, because there's like a limit to what faculty can do when it comes to like negotiating with admin. Because even when I'm talking about being a teacher, of like having to rely on my authority in order to get things done, as opposed to it being a constructive conversation between two parties of equal worth and authority and power. And really having to impose a model in which you have to actually work to earn somebody's trust, which is how it should be. I mean, what is admin doing to earn the trust of faculty of color? That should be the different dynamic that's set up.
And not overloading them with doing the work. That's the other thing.
Thank you.
Will had a question. Mm-hmm.
I had, so my question is from the, I guess, I don't know, in regards to like getting support. Sometimes I feel like, Amanda, like you said, like I feel like this is a space for me. I have other spaces, with some women of color faculty, and sometimes I feel like, yeah, I would like to expand and have more folks whose students need it, Yeah, to like learn things and to try things. But then I think, do I want them here? I don't know. I feel of two minds. Like, do I want to be fighting all the time and convincing, or do I want to share in community and feel uplifted? And my answer is different, depending on my mood that day. I don't know. But I was wondering about, I just had a flashback to when I was in graduate school. I had a wonderful professor, African-American professor of politics. And she taught us one semester, we were supposed to get ready for our qualifying exams, and we were taking American politics. And she did the canon plus updates that always that were written by, folks of color, women, feminists, and the students hated it. They kept saying, you're not going to be able to get us ready for this test that we have to take. And it was really just awful, awful. And then I all these things I had forgotten about that this had happened. And then I remember she had asked us to all write something for her dossier for full, and she didn't get full. And she was our only Black faculty in the department. And then she left and went to a different university. But I'm just I feel like the pressure comes from both administration and deans, but also we're a predominantly white institute. Pitzer is a predominantly white institution. The other colleges are here white. And so sometimes when you do these things, let's spend 10 minutes talking about what are your values and what does it mean to learn, not from an individualistic perspective, but that we're here to learn as a community, and no one should fail. And why can't everybody get an A? And what's my role in helping folks get an A? And what's everybody's role in helping each other get an A? Sometimes I think students generally respond to that, but I always have some students, and I'm going to stereotype and say mainly they're men and straight and white. And they're like, this was such a waste of my time. I'm busy. I have things to be learning. I have things to do. Or these kinds of sitting and talking about each other's work and how we feel and what are we nervous about or what brings us joy. These are a waste of my time. I have 75 minutes. So I feel like it's both. That kind of mindset is so pervasive throughout this, the institution of education. That's how we've been trained. And I feel frustrated by that. So I don't know if I have a question or if I'm just venting. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I feel that really hard. I mean, I have had similar issues with some white male students, and I've dealt with it by having an honest conversation in class in front of the other classmates of, let's talk about toxic masculinity, where I'm facilitating it, but the women get to speak up and be like, hey, I saw this happen, or this is ridiculous, or X, Y, Z, and really taking some of these men to task and being like, it might be a waste of time in your perspective, but it isn't the only one that matters. And here's other perspectives that can actually change your life for the better. And it can be cathartic in the sense of, we can't do that to all, admin quite yet, but these are young men who will probably become admin one day. So how do we get them to at least temporarily confront their insecurities and self-loathing in a classroom context where it technically is actually very safe for them? Yeah. And even, for white people to this is the work of anti-racism, of managing white insecurity in your colleagues. Because I mean, I can't do that because I'll be the angry Black woman, but how do other white people put their necks out there and say, hey, you're triggered by this, let's talk through this so you don't inflict it upon this innocent Black woman who won't get her job.
I know, Andre, you had another question that you wanted to follow up.
I had an academic question, but I'm going to pivot because I think genealogy, we can say that for another time. But my question actually is, Amanda, when you do this work for Black feminist pedagogy, how are you finding the intersection with Black feminist work and healing? Because my own work is trying to understand teacher educators of color. And I think intuitively, there's a lot of Black feminist intuitions. And I'm just reading Patricia Hill Collins' book for the first time. So I'm still trying to be versed in that. But how are you finding the intersection between Black feminist pedagogy and healing for yourself and maybe with your students?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned briefly the Toni Morrison class emerged after I had a friend who committed suicide in April at the beginning of the pandemic. And I structured the class around my experience of grieving her death, because the class was divided into the Oedipal family structure, narcissism and masochism, and mourning and melancholia, and basically using the different novels to walk us through those different phases. And then I also had this poetry lab where I structured it around the 7 stages of grief. And I had a poet come in every other week and do a workshop where they did poems and led exercises that would help us walk through what that emotion meant. And I learned from that the experience of, I have to grieve past versions of myself so that I can show up as a better person in the classroom. So how do we not just reserve grief for when people physically die, but also when we want to let go of, past traumatic events? And I think that actually helped my students, because I was always terrified of talking about that with my students, but they'll always come up to me after class and be like, hey, I appreciate you saying that, because they had never known someone who had grieved someone who had committed suicide. And it made them think twice about, hey, if I do this, someone will really miss me. And even like making them feel comfortable enough to go and seek help for themselves and like check on their friends and different things. So I think that through my own transparency, I was able to create a community of healing among my students where they're actually still in contact today and still look out for each other and know that they can come to me if they want to talk about something.
Gloria, I thought I had seen your hand.
Yeah, it was going to be a comment to Barbara's comment. So I think it was before, but now I'm not sure.
Sorry.
But I just wanted to think about, like, we were talking about these people who say, oh, this was a waste of time. And I want to take a moment to recognize that sometimes that's our immediate reaction to things. But maybe in the long term, they may remember those conversations later and realize, oh, and then connect to them because something happens to them or something happens to someone that is close to them. And then they start connecting the dots and they're like, well, actually, that was not a waste of time. And that is helping me now. So, and that's why, for example, I hate teaching evaluations because, sometimes you make them do very uncomfortable things and they don't like them and they put that in the teaching evaluation. But then years later, they talk to you and they're like, yeah, actually I hated your course. And then now I realized how important it was. So I want to be like hopeful and optimistic about even when they have a negative reaction, it may have some kind of positive outcome in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely it. Yeah, there's no instant gratification in this work oftentimes. And they have to get accustomed to doing the internal work themselves as opposed to just being a blank automaton that they can pour knowledge into. Like you're teaching them how to become human. And that takes a long time, takes a lifetime.
I'm aware of the time and I just wanted to make sure if there were any last comments you wanted to make, Amanda, or anything that you wanted to sort of do before we were out of time, that you had space to do that. And then I also wanted to make sure that I thanked everyone for being here and for making the time today. We know how busy you are. The recording will be available in a couple days when I figure out how to YouTube it. And then, but it will be private, so it won't be public on the web, but it'll be available to y'all. So if there's things that, and if there are other things you need, the transcripts or whatever, we're happy to provide those as well. So I'll leave the last word to you, Amanda, and thank you for your time so much.
Of course, yeah, thank you. I'll just drop the link to the zine right quick so y'all can have access to it. I just really appreciate y'all being willing to listen and engage. I learned so much from all of your assignments too. I'm going to have to incorporate those as well. I hope that you all continue to just be in community with each other and exchange ideas, because that's actually where the change happens, of folks waking up and realizing, hey, this could be so much better than this. How do we come together to create a better society for us and our students who we love and care for? I mean, they're like the next generation, so we owe it to them to be the best versions of ourselves.
Thank you so much for your time today. We just appreciate it so much. And yeah, thankful for all of you too that are doing the good work and being here. And so until next time, take care. Have a good last couple of weeks of the semester, everybody. Hang in there, be tough, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.